Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression, but not in the usual Wall Street villains heroic New Deal way. We're going to look at it through the lens of the Austrian School of Economics, which is the school of thought that believes bad ideas should actually have consequences. To understand the Great Depression, we must first understand the 1920s, a decade that progressives love to call a bubble and Austrians prefer to call a warning label no one read. The 1920s were a period of rapid industrial growth, rising productivity, new technologies such as electricity, automobiles, and radios. And, here's the key, easy money, also known as cheap credit. From 1921 to 1929, industrial production rose by roughly 70%, and real GDP grew at about 4 to 5% annually. This didn't happen by accident. It happened in large part because the Federal Reserve, created in 1913, decided it could improve upon the wisdom of markets by manipulating interest rates. And what could possibly go wrong? Now, don't get confused. The 1920s was a prosperous time in American history, fueled by deregulation and low taxes. The problem is that artificially lowered interest rates overheated the economy, that unsound monetary policies kicked off an economic downturn, and as we will see, became a crisis by government meddling. The Austrian school, think Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, two men who believed economics should be grounded in reality rather than wishful thinking, argued that the Great Depression was not a failure of capitalism, but a failure of credit expansion. Mises famously wrote, "There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. In plain English, if you artificially lower interest rates, you send a false signal to entrepreneurs. They believe savings are plentiful, long-term investments are sustainable, and risk is low. In reality, none of this is true. Between 1921 and 1928, the Fed expanded the money supply by roughly 60%, interest rates were held artificially low, credit flowed like cheap beer at a college party. This led to malinvestment. Capital poured into projects that only made sense under distorted interest rates. Housing speculation, stock margin buying, and overextended industrial investment followed. The boom wasn't real. It was monetary cosplay. Contrary to what Hollywood teaches you, the stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. It merely revealed it. The crash was the moment the economy collectively said, "Oh, so that wasn't sustainable." The Austrian view is blunt. The crash was necessary, a painful but inevitable correction where bad investments are liquidated, prices fall, and resources reallocate to productive uses. Left alone, this process is ugly, but relatively short, which brings us to Herbert Hoover. Hoover is often remembered as a do-nothing president. This is one of the greatest myths in American history, right up there with "the check is in the mail" and "this will only take 5 minutes." Hoover intervened aggressively. He pressured businesses not to cut wages. Real wages rose approximately 10% from 1929 to 1932. He supported public works programs, including the Hoover Dam. He signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, raising tariffs on over 20,000 goods. Smoot-Hawley deserves special mention because it managed to reduce international trade by roughly 40%, anger our trading partners, and turn a recession into a global catastrophe. As Austrian economist Murray Rothbard put it, Hoover was the first president to treat a depression as a disease to be cured by massive government intervention. In short, Hoover tried to freeze prices, wages, and trade in place, preventing the very adjustments needed for recovery. If Hoover dipped his toe into intervention, Franklin Roosevelt cannonballed into it. The New Deal was built on the belief that the Depression persisted because markets were failing and that government needed to manage recovery. Let's look at what FDR actually did. 1. Economic relief as leverage. FDR absolutely provided relief. The CCC, WPA, and PWA put millions to work. Federal spending increased dramatically. The federal government became the central planner of economic life, but relief came with strings attached. Aid flowed through federal agencies that controlled wages and prices through the NRA, paid farmers not to produce food while people were hungry, centralized power in Washington on an unprecedented scale. Roosevelt famously said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." which is ironic because nothing terrified businesses more than constantly changing rules, taxes, and regulations. Between 1933 and 1939, unemployment never fell below 14%. Private investment remained depressed. The economy fell back into recession in 1937 to 38 when modest tightening occurred. So much for bold, persistent experimentation. From an Austrian perspective, the New Deal prolonged the Depression rather than ending it. Why? 1. Price controls prevented adjustment markets need prices to move. The New Deal treated falling prices like a moral failure rather than an economic signal. 2. Policy uncertainty. Crushed investment businesses didn't know what the tax code would be next year, what regulations would exist next month, whether profits would be labeled unfair. As economist Robert Higgs later showed, regime uncertainty suppressed long-term investment throughout the 1930s. 3. Debt and dependency became normalized. Federal spending, deficits, and entitlement-style thinking became embedded into American political life. Ah, yes, the argument that war spending is prosperity. Nothing says economic health like rationing, price controls, and sending young men overseas to get shot. Yes, GDP rose during World War II, but consumer goods were scarce. Living standards were tightly controlled. Private investment was crowded out. The real recovery came after the war, when price controls were lifted. Government spending fell by nearly 40%. Taxes were cut. Markets were allowed to function again. Funny how that works. The interventions of the 1930s fundamentally changed the American economy. They normalized permanent federal deficits, central banking as economic manager, government as first responder to every downturn. Each crisis since, from the 1970s stagflation to 2008 to COVID, has followed the same logic. 1. Easy money creates distortions. 2. The bust arrives. 3. Government intervenes more aggressively. 4. The baseline level of intervention ratchets upward. The snowball keeps rolling downhill. Hayek warned us in The Road to Serfdom, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. Sound familiar? The Austrian school does not deny pain, it denies illusion. The Great Depression teaches us artificial booms lead to inevitable busts. Government efforts to prevent adjustment prolong suffering. Economic freedom recovers faster than economic control. The tragedy of the 1930s was not capitalism run wild. It was capitalism tied down, blindfolded, and told to perform. Or, to put it in terms even politicians might understand, you cannot fix a hangover by drinking more. Thank you.